interesting for you, please do ask any questions you have during the session. I will be glad to answer them. And of course, if maybe we can't answer some of the questions now, you can still find me on Twitter, on LinkedIn. You can find me on YouTube. I have a nice channel that has plenty of information and of details about Spring Security, Spring, Java in general, with hands-on examples. So do find me afterwards if you want to discuss more about different other topics. Today we'll discuss about authentication implemented in Spring applications with Spring Security. Spring Security is a framework that is part of the Spring ecosystem that is, of course, working with protecting your applications. So mainly that means authentication and authorization. And today we will focus only on authentication. Later on, I will have a session somewhere in at the end of the month, I think, where I will discuss the basic architecture of both authentication and authorization. Today we will focus on different ways to configure the authentication for Spring applications using Spring Security. And as I usually do, I will write these configurations together with you. I don't generally like to use presentations because I find them boring. But in an hour or so, 15 minutes we have left, we will implement some examples, and I will try to make you aware of everything is important to know in regards to authentication implemented in Spring Security in Spring applications. The authentication, for those of you who might not be aware, is the process in which an application identifies the user before applying different restrictions. Applying the restrictions is called the authorization part. But before it can authorize some requests, an application first needs to authenticate the caller, the sender of the request. And that's basically the authentication. And depending on what kind of application we implement, we have different ways in which we can implement the authentication. So let's start with a new project, because that's the thing I like the most to do, and teach by example. Don't forget to ask me questions if you have. I hope all of you already see my screen. I understood that this meeting will be recorded, so I hope Matt will place it somewhere to be accessible afterwards as well, in case you need to re-watch it. I will create a Spring Boot project using Spring Initializer using my IntelliJ idea here. And let's just call this with Meetup example 1. I don't have a lot of inspiration in names, but the only thing we need, because for our examples here, the easiest is just implement some web applications. I will create a web application, and because I want to secure it, what I want to present you today is authentication. I will need the Spring Security dependencies. So I added both the Spring Web and Spring Security dependencies to my project, and then I will start creating the project. And we need to wait maybe a couple of seconds for IntelliJ to index everything and download all the dependencies. And let's see, just start with a very casual way of implementing a backend for a web application today is most likely having RESTful endpoints that are probably in almost all real-world examples today called from a different JavaScript framework, application framework, like React, Angular, Vue, and so on. So that's very likely to be the most often scenario encountered today in applications. But anyway, what we do here is that being that we implement a web application with Spring, what we are actually using behind the scenes is Spring MVC. So whether you use RESTful endpoints or simple controllers, the way of configuring the authentication is actually the same. So with our example, we can say we cover all the possible examples of web applications. So for our simple demonstration, let me just create a controller here and say this controller has a REST endpoint. We will call it demo controller. And the only thing it does is exposes a very simple REST endpoint, which you can define by using an action. And we will just return a string. So make sure that we can access this through HTTP GET method. We can define a path if you want. So we can say that we want to access this endpoint at a specific path, say demo. And yeah, if you didn't define a path, it will be the root one, but that's the same thing. So let's go now and work on the configuration. So the configuration, I prefer to put all the configuration in a separate package for a better organization of my project. But in our simple example, we anyway only have a class. So let's call it project config, our only class. In a real world application, you might have, and you usually have, more configuration classes. But since we have a small example here, one will be enough. So what you will see, firstly, if I'm going to start this application the way it is now, so you see I didn't do basically anything in terms of configuring authentication, but because I added the Spring Security dependency to my project, and by default, if you create a Spring Boot project with Spring Initializer, you are using Maven. So you can see here in the POM XML file, the Spring Security dependency. If I'm running this one now, you will see that by default, our application is secured using HTTP basic. And I want to prove it. So let me start the application now. Being that we didn't configure anything, you will see that a default user is created with a random password. This happens every time you start your Spring Boot application, which uses Spring Security with the out-of-the-box configuration. So if I'm trying now in a browser to access localhost demo, you will be redirected to a form login. By default, both form login and basic HTTP are used. And if you are, do I have a Postman here? I used to have a Postman here, so let me see if I can find one. And we will try from Postman to use basic authentication. So basic authentication and form login are the first two authentication ways that you can use with your applications that I want to discuss about. So that is demo, if I remember correctly. And if I try to call it like this, then I get a 401 unauthorized, as you can see here. So in order to get authenticated, I have to use basic authentication, and with the user and with the password that I copy paste from here, which is always a different one. And this is the way, again, this is the way Spring Security works with the default configuration. So you see, once I've used the correct username and password using HTTP basic, the response has a 200 OK status, and I get the answer. So we don't want to rely on the default configuration. The default configuration is only to make sure that the dependency, your Spring Boot project correctly works with the Spring Security dependency, but you need to define your own ways to authenticate in your app. So how do you do that? Well, the oldest way to do this is just extend the Web Security Configurer Adapter class. And using this class, you can override one of the three configure methods. The most used one is the one that gets as a parameter HTTP security. We use this configure method that gets HTTP security as a parameter to define almost all the configurations in terms of authentication and authorization with Spring Security. So that's why here I will just generate and override the configure of HTTP security method. And this is where I will just say HTTP, and then I will choose one of the many DSL methods for configuring authentication. And I will start with HTTP basic, and then I will build over HTTP basic, showing you different ways. So today we will discuss about HTTP basic, form login, and then I will implement you an example of single sign-on with GitHub. And furthermore, I will discuss with this one, the single sign-on relies on OAuth behind the scenes. And then I will discuss with you about a couple more DSL methods which allow you to create a resource server in case of an OAuth system, a client, and even how to authenticate your apps with SAML 2. But yeah, let's start with the very beginning, because I don't want to put all of them together. I want to take it step by step. So first of all, what you need to know is that the oldest way is extending web security configure adapter and overriding the configure method that gets an HTTP security as a parameter. If we have the time at the end, I will show you also a different fashion in which you can implement the same thing, but I would say a better but a newer approach. But in my opinion, you need to know both of them, because more likely in applications you will see this approach rather than the new approach. So let's start with this one, which is more often used from my experience. I have some experience with plenty of applications. I work as a consultant, and I've consulted and I worked on dozens of projects up to now. So you can trust me that statistically I can make a good statistics on what and how it's used in terms of Spring security. At least that's why I wrote a book about that as well, because I have plenty of knowledge in this domain. So HTTP basic, there is one more thing I would like to do. I will write the simplest authorization rule that says authorize request, any request, authenticated. And due to the fact that we don't discuss today about authorization, let me skip discussing this line. In one of the next meetups, I will discuss about, again, authorization as well. But today we mainly focus on authentication. So I will discuss about this line, and I will change it to prove how different authentications work, and that's basically the topic. So I will only tell you that this line 14 I have here says require authentication for any request. That means whatever endpoint you call, in whatever fashion this application now imposes the user to have first authenticated. That's actually what it means. That's because you can actually permit all the requests if you want, and that means you don't need any authentication on any request. But if we would do something like that, then we can't prove what we are doing. So we need our endpoints to require authentication, because we discuss authentication today. So you want to, of course, test whatever authentication we discuss here. And the first is HTTP basic. So what is HTTP basic? Why is it important? HTTP basic is the simplest authentication method. Is a way an authentication way that you will rarely find in practice applied on simple endpoints. You find it mostly together with other authentication implementations, such as in case of an OAuth system. But it's very unlikely that you will have to implement endpoints with HTTP basic. But it is a very good way to demonstrate how some logic that you implement in terms of authentication works. So that means you will find this method very often used with examples and demonstrations. Even in my book, I've used HTTP basic a lot, just because it somehow just allow you focus on something else. That's why when you use HTTP basic, in examples you will see it used pretty much because it allows the student focus on something else. That's basically what will help me now is teaching you HTTP basic, is first of all making you aware of what it is, so that when you will find it used on several other examples, you will know why it is that used there. Telling you that you most likely won't use it directly out of the box on endpoints. And of course, being a simple way to just prove how authentication works as our first example. That means that once I've configured HTTP basic here, what I need is a username and a password, because HTTP basic, what actually implies is that on the request, I'm going to my postman. Where is my postman? Here. And I'm going to the headers. So see, by default, I could use HTTP basic, which is this basic authentication is equivalent to HTTP basic. So if I'm going to the headers, you will see that what actually Postman did was to create a header named authorization. Be attentive, authorization, actually this header, even if it's called authorization, it's actually used for authentication. So I know it sounds strange, but that's the way it works. So it's one of the things that remain from the very beginning of the development of the HTTP protocol. So sometimes you will see that authentication and authorization are misused. So the authorization header, even if it's authorization, at this moment it's used for authentication. Basic is the prefix basic in front of what you see next. It's telling me that I'm using HTTP basic. And what is basically next is nothing more than the base 64 encoding of the username and the password that I have used, in my case, this one and this one. So I can basically very easily prove you that if I can copy this, string here and go to a browser and search for base 64 decode, we can put it here and press decode, and you will see that you can base 64 decode it into exactly the user column and then the password B63B something something. So that's basically exactly what I used here, user and B63B something something. So that's what HTTP basic does. HTTP basic expects you, when you request an endpoint, to have the username and the password separated by a column, base 64 encoded, and prefixed with basic in the authorization header. And that's the way the authentication works when you use HTTP basic. So in my case here, I can, of course, I can use it the way it is now. If I want to have, and I usually want to have a custom user, and I need to define a user detail service. The user detail service, which I can add as a bin in the context, it allows me to define the user. So this is basically an interface, and usually you implement it to take the user details from a database, but to make things easy, what I will basically do now is to use an in-memory user details manager, which is an implementation, again, mostly used for tutorials. What is that? User details service, new in-memory user details manager. And in this user details manager that I will lately return, I will simply add a new user with username, whatever you want here, Bill, password 12345. Never use passwords in clear in a real world application. And authority. So authorities is basically what the user can do and is related to the authorization. They are mandatory. That's why I'm adding them here. But you don't need to, we don't need to discuss them right now, actually. The password encoder, because in real world apps, passwords are usually hashed. A password encoder is the component in Spring Security that works with hashing or encrypting the password depending what you want to do. For our example, we will skip that. So I will use something that is called no-op password encoder, which actually comes from no operation. And you see it's striked out, and the reason it's striked out because it has been marked as deprecated. And it has been marked as deprecated because you should never use it in a real world application, because no-op password encoder means you are not hashing the password, means you are using the password in plain text, like see it as it is, like here, which is never something you must do in a real world scenario. So the passwords always needs to be stored in a hashed, strongly hashed algorithm, I would say, to make sure that if somebody manages to steal them, they cannot reverse the algorithm and use them. So let's stop and rerun and try to use the basic authentication here to log in with Bill and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going back to my Postman. Sorry, going back to my Postman. Now I should be able to access my endpoint with Bill and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see I can do that. And if I'm going back to the browser, and I will try to access the same endpoint demo. So you see, firstly, when I had the default configuration, I was seeing this nice form login. But if I'm going now, I won't see it anymore. You will basically see this ugly box that requires your username and password, which is the behavior the browser has when accessing an endpoint that only handles HTTP basic. So the reason here we are not seeing the form anymore is because now, by our configuration for the authentication method, we explicitly say here that we only expect HTTP basic to work. But if we would like to use the form login, then what you can do is change this, and I will comment it out so that you will be able at the end to compare them. Instead of HTTP basic, I will call the form login DSL method, which is the second authentication approach, the second authentication method that we discuss. So usually in a web application, if you want to implement a login, you don't expect to use HTTP basic. Again, HTTP basic is anyway mostly only used for tutorial demonstrations nowadays. But if you have a web application, you do expect to see a nice login form and not this ugly box that is the way you can see it here displayed by my Chrome. So if I'm restarting the app right now, did I already restart it? I'm not sure. If I'm restarting the app right now, and due to the fact that I changed HTTP basic into form login, now when you go back, so I cancel this, you will see that calling demo will again redirect me to a nice login page. The login page is a feature that comes out of the box with Spring Security. If you don't like the way it looks, you can customize it. Now, doing CSS and HTML is not the purpose of today's lesson, so let's keep it as it is. But keep in mind that you can basically change the way it looks like. It's not a problem. But the idea is that all the mechanisms behind the scene of logging in is directly supported by Spring Security, so you don't have to implement it again. That's because depending on how much experience you have with applications, you might believe that to implement a login, you need to write all the logic behind the scenes yourself, which is not the case with Spring, because if you use Spring Security, almost any kind of authentication is provided out of the box. So the simplest is HTTP basic. The next level is having a form login, which is having this nice form in a web page where you can now just authenticate. So what was my user Bill and the password 12345, and I'm signing in. Yes, Chrome tells me that 12345 is not the strongest password I could have, but we don't care about that right now. But the idea is that you can clearly see that the authentication correctly worked. So you can log in, you can log out as well. It provides also a page for the logout. So you can log out and now it redirects you back to login. And to do that, again, I only had to write one line of code. So it's only one line of code there that I needed to write for that, which is basically why we use Spring Security, why we use frameworks in general. So we do use Spring Security because we want to, as much as possible, avoid writing boilerplate code, write as less lines of code as we can to implement our security our security capabilities of the application. Okay, but what else can we do? Is that the only thing we can do, HTTP basic and form login? Well, no, of course not. We actually have a lot more things we can implement out of the box in terms of authentication with Spring Security. So HTTP, and let me enumerate some of the most important. We won't discuss all of them because I would need a day, not an hour, to discuss them, but let me enumerate all the capabilities for Spring Security. And then I would like to discuss also one more simple capability that we can implement very easily, which is the single sign-on. And then I will invite you to search my YouTube channel, where you will find, I'm not sure if I did present all of the, because Spring Security is quite a big framework. It's a big tome. But yeah, you can see that I actually wrote a full 560 pages book on that. So and if I could have had written more, I think if the editors wanted to write me more, I could have written at least 700 pages. That's how complex Spring Security is. So I can't promise you I will teach you everything in a few hours, but I'm definitely sure that on my YouTube channel you will find at least 70% of what Spring Security is, and I think it's everything that's very relevant is there as well. So it will be on 100% what I consider to be very important for any developer to know about Spring and Spring Security. So what else besides the form login and HTTP basic? So we have also the possibility to implement an OAuth to login, which is that, let me comment it out for the moment. I will say here, this is the single sign-on that we will discuss in a couple of minutes. You can as well implement a OAuth to client. These two are usually very often confused by developers. I will explain the difference when I get to the login. You can implement a resource server, sorry, HTTP OAuth to resource server as well. This is another way you can implement your authentication capabilities. You can use SAML login, which is an XML-based protocol for authentication. And I hope I didn't miss anything. So I think these are all of them, aren't they? So just to make sure, but I think that's basically everything. Oh, you have basically, you can do even a certificate authentication, which is very rarely used, but let's put it here as well. So you see all these methods here, from HTTP basic to that X509, these are called DSL methods for configuring the authentication in Spring Security. So whenever you think about how to configure the authentication, what you do basically is, which is the DSL method you need to call to configure that. Do you want to configure HTTP basic? Then you will have to call HTTP basic. Do you want to have a form login, which is what I presented a few minutes earlier? Then you will call the form login method. Do you want something else? Then Spring Security provides you with other capabilities, which are different ways to implement authentication for your application. So that's how you configure authentication in Spring Security. Now, let me show you also how to implement a single sign-on, a single OAuth to a single sign-on login using this DSL method. For the others, I would need again more time, so we don't have that time. But you will find them demonstrated on my YouTube channel anyway. So you will find them if you really need to know anything about them. But I want to keep this project, and let's basically create a second one. So just to be sure that that I keep all the implementations in place, because I will need to add one more dependency here. So I will say our meetup example 2, and then I'm going here and I will say I still want to create a web application, and I still want string security, and I want to use this window. Let's terminate the other application. And guess what? I will basically do the same thing. So to demonstrate the way it works with single sign-on, I will need a controller. So let's say we have a demo controller, same as we had, demo controller, which exposes a REST endpoint. So here, whatever you want, let's use a get mapping directly on the root, because we don't care so much where it is. And of course, the configuration. Find the configuration class, and all the configurations classes in Spring, are annotated with configuration. And we continue to extend web security configure adapter. And override, of course, the configure method. And of course, we want to configure the authentication, which in our case is OAuth to login. And again, for the authorization, I will just say that all the requests needs to be authenticated. So OAuth to login, if you will search more here, you will see that we have some more things starting here with OAuth 2. So you have the OAuth to login, you have the OAuth to resource server, and the OAuth to client. And this one is what we want to implement now. So this is in our application, implement login, or even better say, implement a single sign-on solution login with Spring Security. This one here that is often confused with the OAuth to login. So people, developers often make a confusion between these two. This is to implement an OAuth to client that accesses resources on a resource server using the client credentials gun type. So I don't know how experienced you are with OAuth 2 and what does that mean. You can find an entire playlist where I discuss implementing OAuth 2 with Spring Security on my YouTube channel. But the idea of this login, which is also presented somewhere on my blog. So I won't talk about it now, but oh, sorry, on my blog here you find an article or where you can find out how to implement. This is a resource server, or maybe not. Maybe not. Yeah, sorry. I thought I had an article about that as well. So, oh, my battery seems Okay, now it's good. So it wasn't plugged in. Even though I say I don't have one now, I will basically add one later on my blog about OAuth 2 clients. So I will add such an article on my blog. I had the impression I already added it, but it seems I don't. This allows you to implement an OAuth 2 client. If you don't know what an OAuth 2 client is, don't bother about it now. If you want to learn what OAuth 2 is, I recommend you taking it from the very beginning. And the Spring Security playlist on my YouTube channel would be good for you. So if you want to find my YouTube channel, just find it by my name, and you will see here that I have an entire playlist with about 30 something 34 lessons on Spring Security, and you will find there everything you need. The same with the resource server. So this one is when you want to implement a resource server with Spring Security. And again, a lot of things to discuss about that. It's still part of what we call the DSL methods for authentication, but they are more complex things that we would rather take them in a separate chat and not now. However, this OAuth login, which is the single sign-on implementation, allows you to very easily implement some kind of form login way that uses behind the scenes OAuth 2, and it basically uses what we call the authorization code one type to implement the login of your application without even needing to write more than maybe a few lines of code. So why shouldn't we just try to do this now? Implement this single sign-on, say with GitHub. Well, you can implement single sign-on with a lot of I would say maybe all the social networks offer you single sign-on solutions. So you can do that with Facebook, you can do that with GitHub, you can do that with Google. What is actually single sign-on is using a user provided by another application to allow someone to log in into your application. And you've seen that a lot. I'm sure you've seen that a lot. Is allowing, for example, someone to log in into your application using their Facebook account. So if you want to do something like that, allow someone log in to your website using their Facebook account, their GitHub account, their LinkedIn account, their Twitter account, then that's basically single sign-on, which behind the scenes leverages this framework that's called the OAuth 2, about which you can find a lot of information in either my book or on my YouTube channel. So, for example, if I want here, I have my GitHub account, and my GitHub account, I will sign in. Oh, come on, seriously? Do I have to do that now? It seems that GitHub really wants me to log in now, honestly. Sorry guys, I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting GitHub being, oh, not this one, sorry. Again, so secure with me. So I will try again GitHub. Sign in. Okay, I will write it by hand. So that was 61617. Okay, just sent me another one. That's interesting. Okay, fine. Now I'm here. So I'm going to settings. and I'm going to developer settings here. And what I'm going to do is I will register a new application, which is the one I'm building. I will register it to use it for my app to use it, use GitHub to log in. So to allow the users of my application use their GitHub credentials to log in my application. So for that, I will have to first register my application into GitHub. So how do we call this? Demo? And that would be HTTP. In my case, I'm running it locally, isn't it? So that will be localhost 8080. And then I will basically do something like this. And it gives me, if this is a client ID and the secret, they are basically a user and the password of the application. Don't worry, guys, I will delete them after the, so you will not be able to use this after the presentation. But for now, I will just use them to prove you how this works, how to configure that. So that should be very easy. So the only thing you need to do is use a client registration repository here. Oh, and for that, I need actually to add one more dependency to my POM XML, do I? So out of the box, Spring Security Starter doesn't come with the OAuth 2 client, so you have to manually add it to your dependencies. So I'm adding it here, and then I will do like this. I will index it by reloading the project with Maven. So let's allow it to reload the dependencies. Okay, fine, now I have it. So then I should be able now to use it. So public client registration repository. And what I will do here, will basically return client registration implementation that contains the client registration with those credentials that I have just created. So to make things easy, Spring comes with this class that allows you to simply configure, at least on Facebook, GitHub, Google, and Okta. It's a little bit more complicated if it's not here, but not a lot more complicated. I will use GitHub, so I will benefit of the simplicity offered by Spring Boot, and I will create first a configuration where the only things I need to put are the client ID and the client secret. And then I will take this configuration and add it into my repository that I then add to the Spring context. The bin above the methods adds it to the Spring context. The client ID and secret, I just take them from here. Here is the client ID. Here is the client secret. Okay. And that should be it. So was that difficult? I'm sure you didn't find it difficult, because the only thing you need to do is tell Spring Security that you want to do a single sign-on, and then just configure the credential of your applications that you have generated in the specific framework you want to use. So for example, I'm using GitHub. I registered an application in GitHub. I got a client ID and the secret, and then I'm able to use them here. You can do the same with Facebook. You can do the same with Twitter. You can do the same with any social network that acts as an authorization server that offers you this service. And it's basically in a few lines of code, you can implement that. You can have more than one. Maybe your next question would be, can I do both authentication with GitHub, Facebook, and then maybe I want a third one as well? And the answer is yes. You just have to create more objects like this one and then add them separately with a comma here. They will all be used, and the user will be able to choose which authentication method they want to use. So it's very simple. And now to prove it, I will basically log out my GitHub. So allow me log out. And I will start the application. And if I didn't miss anything, and hopefully I didn't miss anything, then I should be able now, when I call my localhost 8080, it redirects me to GitHub. Then I have to log into GitHub with my credentials. I do authorize the application, and then I'm redirected and I can see my app. So it behaves correctly. So see how easy it was for me to implement a login with GitHub. So now I can use my GitHub credentials to log into my application. And the same easy would have been for me to do that with Facebook, Google. I can have, again, multiple authentications if I want configured. In a real world scenario, these credentials would most likely be stored somewhere safe in the database. Never put them directly in the code. This is only happening in an example, in a tutorial. But in a real world solution, they should be stored somewhere safely, at most in a database. But otherwise, I would recommend a vault for your secrets, not a database. By the way, I should do something like now deleting the application, because it's not really okay. I allow you see the credentials. You could use them for something else then, or someone who sees the video. So now I don't have the app anymore, so nobody can use them anymore. But the idea, you have seen already the idea, and I recommend you implement by yourself an example like this one. So to conclude this lesson, because I don't want to spend more of your time, and I hope you already gained something valuable from this, Spring Security has a very easy way of implementing authentication. The authentication is mainly configured through a DSL method. You can configure more DSL methods, so you can have multiple ways to authenticate the user at the same time. And then in case of some other authentication methods, like when things are a little bit more complex, you sometimes need to add 1 or 2 beans in the context, but usually is a very short number of lines of code you need to write to implement something like that. So Spring Security allows you to implement your authentication, say, in a very simple, with a very simple and short approach. Yeah, anyway, let me know if you have questions. So I came to an end of my presentation. And again, I think at least from the top of the mountain, whatever I could do in 1 hour, I have made you an idea, and I have built you a big picture of what authentication with Spring Security is. Now, of course, as I've told you from the very beginning, do ask questions if you have. Put them either in the chat or just turn on your microphone and let me know what concern do you have. Was anything unclear? Do you want me to repeat something? Do you want me to provide you some resources that go into more details with something besides my YouTube channel and my book? Do let me know now, or we can close the session. Yeah, let's see, one question, fantastic. What is the approach we want to authenticate alongside GitHub, also with database username and password? So if I correctly understood the question is, what shall we do to allow our application to use a third party such as GitHub or Facebook, but also have its own credentials in the database? In that case, we would basically configure both approaches, form login and OAuth 2. And that should allow the user to choose between the form login and OAuth 2 login. But in my case, I would need, I think it will cry because I didn't configure any user details, service, and password encoder. So let's see what happens here. So maybe I'm directed now. Oh, it's because I deleted the application. It's now giving me an error on GitHub. So it tries to log into GitHub. But the idea is the same. So once you configure correctly your OAuth to login, then you can also use the phone login. And if you want, you can actually have HTTP basic at the same time. So that should work as well. So you can have multiple authentication capabilities configured at the same time. That did that answer your question, Alex? Super. Otherwise, I see no other question in the chat. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I hope it was interesting enough for you. I hope to see you also on my YouTube channel. Join me on LinkedIn, Twitter as well, and the next presentations. Thank you very much. Have an excellent time for learning further. Cheers.